Hello boys and girls, we are diving into our integer operation unit, and we're going to go ahead and start off by looking at adding integers. Will be our first operation we study. We're going to take a look at a couple of different strategies, three in particular, to help you add integers. Now you don't have to become a master of all three necessarily, but I'm giving you options because I think all three of them are very valuable. They provide visuals to help you really understand why you get the answers that you get. So today we're going to work on counter method when we're adding integers. The first few are going to seem very basic and almost silly. Bear with me though, because it will become more complex and it will be honestly very helpful for you if you can just bear with me. So when we're adding the same sign, this is where it's really easy. So we're going to use counters. I'm going to use plus and minus signs because I don't really feel like filling in a whole bunch of circles. So we're just going to go ahead and use positive and negative signs. Now I usually draw myself a little mat. So this problem, I'm going to be adding, I have two negatives. So I'm going to go ahead and put two negatives on my mat. And I'm going to be adding to that, physically adding to it 3 negatives. And what does that give me? Well, that gives me a grand total of 5 negatives. The answer is -5. Same thing with positives. I'm going to go ahead and draw myself a little mat here. I have 4 positives. And to that, I will add 2 positives. 1, 2. That gives me a grand total of 6 positives. You can put the plus sign. You don't have to. You can just write 6. Again, I know this seems silly with the same signs, but it will be helpful for us when we have different signs. So let's go ahead and flip over and let's take a look at a few more problems and then we'll come up with a conclusion. So if I have 3 positives plus 4 positives, well, that gives me 7 positives, which we already knew. These are very basic problems, but again, we're just kind of getting used to this counter method. 2 positives plus 6 positives. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's a grand total of 8 positives. Again, you can leave the positive symbol off if you'd like. It gets more interesting when we're looking at negatives. So if I have 3 negatives, 1, 2, 3, I'm going to go ahead and physically add 4 more negatives. That gives me a grand total of 7 negatives. So I'm going to go ahead and actually stop there with the counter method because I'm starting to notice a pattern, and that's kind of what we're going to conclude at the bottom, that when I'm adding negatives to negatives, I'm just becoming more negative. So really what I'm doing is I'm just adding these numbers normally and I keep the sign the same. So 4 negatives plus 1 more negative, well, that will give me a grand total of 5 negatives. This will give me a grand total of 7 negatives, a grand total of 4 negatives, 9 positives, and 8 positives. So what is our conclusion when we're adding integers with the same sign? We will add normally and keep the sign the same. We're going to keep it the same as the add-in. So if I'm adding 2 negatives, it stays negative. If I'm adding 2 positives, it stays positive. Now again, let's go ahead and take a look at adding numbers with different signs, because this is very basic, very straightforward, very easy. When we have different signs, that's where it gets a little more complicated. So what we're going to take a look at is things called zero pairs. So opposites, when you combine opposites, we call that a zero pair. And more specifically, when we are adding +1 to -1, that is what we call a zero pair. Think about it. If you gain $1 and then spend $1, you now have $0. If you were in debt $1, if you were -$1 and somebody handed you $1, you're now at 0. You have no money. Your overall balance is now 0. So that's why we call those zero pairs. So we can use, this is, again, especially where this is helpful, this counter method, because we will discover a lot of zero pairs are going to pop up and they're equivalent to 0, and that helps us figure out our answer. So if I have 3 positives, so I'm going to go back to this original one. I'm going to kind of reformat it. 3 plus -2. I'm going to go ahead and draw myself my integer mat. I have 3 positives, and to that I will add 2 negatives. Now I'm noticing I have 1, 2, 0 pairs. That is a 0 pair, which is literally worth 0. So that means this is also worth 0. So I usually do this. I cancel them out. I cross them out. And what am I left with? I'm left with 1 positive. Positive 1. Let's do another example together. Let's go ahead and do, let's say, -5 plus 3. Create your integer mat, and you don't even necessarily need to create this little mat for yourself. I have 5 negatives, and to that I will add 3 positives. See how many 0 pairs we've just created. 1, 2, 3. Boom, boom, boom. Those cancel out. I am left with 2 negatives. 2 negatives are left over. Ooh, left over. Left over. So we have 2 negatives left over. Now this is important because this leads us to a major conclusion about what we are actually doing when we're adding integers with opposite signs. Really what we will be doing is subtracting. But we need to figure out, well, what will our sign be at the end? Will it be positive or negative? Well, so let's think about this. In this case, the answer, what's left over, will be the sign of the number in which you have more of those things. So in this case, I have 5 negatives, and I'm adding 3 positives. I have more negatives than positives, so therefore, when all of these cancel out, I will be left with those negatives because there was more of them. So what we call this, to be more specific, we take the sign of the number with the greater absolute value. That is a nice summary of what we're doing. Because a lot of kids will say, oh, you take the sign of the bigger number. You have to be careful. -5 is not and never will be bigger than 3. I understand what you're thinking, but you need to be careful with how you say it. We need to be very precise in math. -5 will never be bigger than 3. The absolute value of -5, however, is greater than the absolute value of -3, which is why this is the sign that we would take. That's why that answer ends up being negative. So let's do one more example together. Let's say I have, I don't know, let's do 6 plus -3. So I'm going to go ahead and start out with 6 positives, 3 negatives. I have just created 3 0 pairs. That all cancels out, goes away. That's 0. It's literally nothing. That's 0. And what am I left with? I'm left with 3 positives. Now let's see if this idea of the greater absolute value holds true. 6 and -3, the absolute value of 6 is definitely bigger, so that's why it remained positive, which we just proved with our visual model. So let's do a few more together. -4 plus 2, 4 negatives, 2 positives. I have 2 0 pairs, leaves me with 2 negatives. -4 has a greater absolute value than 2, which is why it remained negative, and what we did here was we subtracted. -1, +5. I have 1 0 pair. I'm left with 4 positives. -5, 1 positive. That's 1 0 pair. -4. I'll do one more with counter method. 6 positives. Oh, we just did this one. 3 negatives. I have 3 0 pairs that cancel out. I'm left with 3 positives. Now I'm going to go ahead and use my shortcut. So I'm going to subtract. 6 minus 2 is 4. I have 6 positives, 2 negatives. I have more positives. It will be +4. -6 plus 3, that's going to be 6 negatives, 3 positives. That'll create 3 0 pairs. So I'll subtract. 6 minus 3 is 3. It remains negative because there's more negatives. -8 plus 2, that'll be -6. And -2, I'm subtracting. I take the sign of the quote-unquote, and I'm do air quotes, the higher number, the bigger number. Well, it's really the one with the greater absolute value. -10 and 8. I subtract, I get 2. it remains negative because negative 10 has a greater absolute value. So let's go ahead and state this generalization. So what are we observing when you add integers with different signs? You really are subtracting. You subtract the absolute values of those two numbers. You keep the sign. Of the addend with, I should say, the greater absolute value. And that is our shortcut.